So that should be recording now.
I'm just going to welcome everybody, so I'll turn it over to Scott and we'll do the formal introductions and then we'll take it from there. We usually have Q&A at the end.
Recording.
Okay.
Most of the ones out there.
Okay, everyone, I want to thank you for coming today. I'm Ed Fitzgerald, the president of the Emeritus Center. And I have with us our speaker today, Dr. Maeve Kane from History, and our program co-chair, Scott Burge. I'll turn it over to Scott for the formal introductions of Dr. Kane, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Ed. Wow, well, it looks a lot different from up here. Don't fall asleep like I do, okay?
No, sir.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Maeve Kane, who's an associate professor at our university, where she teaches Indigenous and early American history. Dr. Kane received her BA from Macalester College and her MA and PhD from Cornell. Her first book, Shirts Powdered Red, the Haudenosaunee, did I come close? Okay. The Haudenosaunee Gender, Trade, and Exchange Across 3 Centuries, published by Cornell, argues that the Haudenosaunee women use clothing and material culture to maintain enduring Haudenosaunee identities in the face of American colonial pressures to assimilate and disappear. Her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, the New York Historical Society, the Newberry Library, and the American Philosophical Society. Her other writing has appeared in the journals Ethnohistory and the Journal of Early American History, a featured story, The Raid, in the fall edition of the New York State Archives magazine. And she's the co-author of a forthcoming American Women's History textbook covering the peopling of the Americas to 2021. It's entitled American Women, A New Narrative. There's lots of stuff I could mention, but I think I would rather just go on and introduce one more time Maeve Kane. And if you'd give her a little hearty welcome.
Thank you all so much for being here. First off, I apologize for my voice is a little bit scratchy. I have asthma. I did a COVID test before I came in, so I'm negative. And I also want to thank Scott and Dean for inviting me to be with you all today. This presentation, you guys are actually the first audience besides like the 5 other people in my very small subfield to hear about this new project. I'm working on a book about the popular memory of the American Revolution and what it means as we approach the 250th anniversary in 2026. Because that memory has changed over time. It's not always the same as academic historians, and it tells us a lot about who has been seen as part of the United States, which is an especially politically charged issue, as many of you are aware, given what the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, and now as we head into 2024. So in part, this project is a history of how the American Revolution has been remembered outside of public institutions like museums and outside of academic historians. And in part, it's a oral history of historical reenactment since the bicentennial in 1976. If anybody has read Confederates in the Attic, which was a 1990s examination of Civil War reenacting and Civil War memory, I'm kind of working on Confederates in the Attic for the Revolution. So this is that project. And I'm also thinking about this as a book for a popular audience rather than an academic historian audience. So that's part of why I'm excited to share this with you all. So for the first part of my talk, I'm going to be talking about historical reenactment before the modern era. So historical reenactment. Broadly speaking, I think there's a couple of common threads across both reenacting from like the earliest moment you can kind of identify that through to the modern conception of it. And those are that people do this for a lot of reasons, often very intensely personal reasons that often have very little to do with the revolution itself. And I'll talk a bit about those in both parts of this. And then the other threads that I see in common are whose histories are considered essential and not essential to the history of the American Revolution. This is something that academic historians have debated and wrestled over and has really radically changed in the last like 50 years, I would say. But some of the common threads in how these stories are thought of as essential or not essential in the popular memory is that almost always Native people's history is thought of as essential to the history of the American Revolution. That is very central to many of these reenactments or memorializations. However, women's history and Black history is often excluded, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. So thinking about who is and is not part of the American nation, that becomes, again, very politically charged when thinking about issues of citizenship. And then for Native people, the large thrust of history of most Indigenous nations is arguing for non-inclusion in the United States. The Constitution guarantees recognition of Indigenous nations as separate nations. So that inclusion of Native people and their history within the history of the American Revolution is about this tension between whether or not Native people are part of the United States or are they not, as guaranteed by the Constitution and treaties with individual nations. So one of the first instances of what I think we could call historical reenactment, or people dressing up and kind of staging a particular historical moment, is not 1989. This is a reenactment of a reenactment. In 1989, for George W. Bush's inaugural parade, I don't know exactly why this was restaged, but part of the 1788 Grand Processional in Philadelphia was restaged for Bush's inauguration, the first Bush. And this is a photograph of a recreation of part of that parade. And what happened in 1788 was, with the ratification of the Constitution, Philadelphia, which had been formerly the US capital, was real mad that New York City was the new US capital, and staged this grand federal procession to kind of retain political control. And this grand federal procession, I think, is one of the first moments where you can say this is people reenacting or staging a particular historical moment. And there was not a lot of it. This is a reenactment of a reenactment. So we have like people in 1989 wearing historical 18th century clothes. They've just dressed like that in the 18th century. So in the 1788 version, most of the parade was people just wearing their everyday clothes. Militia units marched, individual like industries, bakers, masons, glass blowers, things like that, staged their own floats, and they just kind of wore their everyday clothes. But as a component of the parade, there were a couple of markers that opened the parade. One of them was this, which is the Grand Federal Edifice. This is the 13 original colonies, and then Rhode Island is missing because it never ratified the Constitution. So there's one column for each of the colonies except for Rhode Island. Oh. And then following it, there was a couple of historical markers for the French alliance between the US and France that helped turn the tide of the war, the Battle of Yorktown, the Battle of Saratoga, the Declaration, and then the Treaty at Paris of 1783 that ended the war itself. So those are the historical moments. Those were not reenacted. Those were just guys on a horse carrying a flag that said the date. But between those and this grand federal edifice was a carriage with two people in it. And those two people, one was dressed just as himself, but he was representing Pennsylvania. And the other one was a white guy dressed as a native chief. And they were recreating, I don't have a lot of details on this, but they were recreating Penn's treaty with the Indians, of passing the calumet or the peace pipe back and forth. And it's the first moment that I think that we see a reenactment of a historical moment where you have somebody dressed as a historical figure portraying a specific historical moment. And I think it's interesting that it's in this particular moment because in 1788, the United States was really getting its ass handed to it in the Northwest Indian War, losing extremely badly for the first time since the Revolution. This is what's now kind of Indiana, Ohio territory, and was really kind of flailing with what to do about Indian diplomacy. Later in the 1790s, the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee would come in and kind of intervene on the Americans' behalf and settle things down. But in 1788, there's this kind of crisis, existential crisis in Philadelphia of thinking about this kind of mythic past of Penn's peaceful relations with the Indians, and then positioning that as very essential to the American story between these earlier moments in the Revolution itself and then the possibility of the grand federal edifice here. So that wasn't recreated in Bush's 1989 inaugural parade, but in the original 1788, I think that speaks to what Americans were thinking immediately after the Revolution was an essential part of that story. And that peace with Native people, even as portrayed as a white guy in a carriage, was an essential part of that story. That's kind of an institutional version of that history. And that's immediately after the American Revolution. There's other parts of this story that are very small, very fractured and scattered. And this is my good friend, Nicholas Veeder, who lived in Scotia, which is like 2 miles from my house right now, which I didn't know when I started this project. Nicholas Veeder is typical of a large handful. I don't know exactly how many men did this, and some women. Typical of veterans of the American Revolution who later in their lives began reenacting the Revolution. This is fairly familiar from the Civil War period. Historians have for a long time known about Civil War veterans. Even before the war ended, veterans of the Civil War would gather and kind of reenact particular moments. Northern and Southern soldiers would pretend to shoot at each other, fall down on a field, and then get up and shake hands. And this was part of the peacemaking process. So far as I know, the American Revolution has not received this kind of attention. Veeder here is supposedly pictured in his original uniform that he received as part of the New York militia when he enlisted at age 15. I'm not quite sure that it's actually the original. But Veeder here is at what was called the Old Stone Fort, or the Old Fort in Scotia. It's no longer standing. And he's at this particularly interesting intersection between like what becomes formalized public history and museums and being just some guy. Because he opened a museum, and his museum was kind of like what you see here, piles of guns. He owned one 17th century Dutch mirror, but there's a description in a magazine of the old fort and Veeder's tours of it where he just collected lots of guns. They were piled in the attic in like literal piles. The reporter said that there was a pistol laying on the floor. It was unclear if it was loaded or not. And he would give shooting demonstrations of these things, guns from the 1740s all the way up through the Civil War. This photo was taken a year before his death in 1862. And Veeder is kind of an interesting character. Like many American Revolutionary veterans, it seems that he started this public performance as part of trying to struggle out of poverty. In the wake of the American Revolution, many American veterans were left in really abject poverty. The U.S. Congress had not yet instituted a formal payment system. There was, in theory, as part of the enlistment, supposed to be bonuses paid. In the early years in the 18 teens, these were only paid to men who had enlisted in formal regiments, regular units, and not to militia units. They were only open to men who had served a certain length of time, and without like strict record keeping, not all men were able to prove that they had served that time. So the vast majority of veterans in the early 19th century were, some of them were disabled, some of them were kind of scraping by on whatever like kind of minimal assistance they could get from telling their stories. So far as we can tell, there's kind of a boom in the Hudson Valley up through Saratoga and part of the Adirondacks, of particularly in New York, because there's this cluster of Revolutionary era sites in New York that was easily traversed with the opening of the Erie Canal in the 1830s. There's kind of a tourist boom. There's a lot of people that came up from New York City, and as a consequence, a lot of men like Veeder in the 1830s in particular, not immediately after the Revolution, started reenacting because that's what people wanted to see. This was so popular that even General Philip Schuyler, one of the only 4 major generals of the Revolution, himself would like go tromping out in this like Saratoga battlefield in January in the snow, taking people around and like giving them tours of the battlefield. And like he wasn't doing it for the money. He was in part doing rehab of his image because he had been court-martialed during the war. That was not successful. So he's doing it for different motivations, but like this is an extremely popular form of entertainment. Nathaniel Hawthorne, when he visited Ticonderoga a few years later, wrote this absolutely scathing letter that there was no veteran dressed up there to get a tour from. He was like, I came all the way up just for this. So it's really part of the expectation of tourism in this area at this time. And a lot of this it was either consciously or unconsciously myth-making. Veeder, I find a particularly interesting character. He's like 99 in this photo. So he enlisted at age 15 and he for sure served. He eventually got his pension very late in life. But there's all this mythology around him of like that he carried this liberty flag at the Battle of Saratoga, and he was important in rallying the troops at Saratoga. He enlisted after Saratoga. His unit also carried a flag that said liberty or death, not liberty. So this is not his flag. And then the whole uniform thing of like, he used this as part of his performance, but I don't think it's a real uniform. Some of the details are ever so slightly off. So he's like constructing this performance over the course of his life for various reasons. But that's how kind of these stories started to get entrenched of the poor veteran, the everyday man who was part of this story. And then the other part of this story is, again, going back to how Native people are incorporated into this mythology. That Grand Federal Procession and Nicholas Veeder and other veterans like him are one trajectory where historical reenactment kind of enters the public history lexicon. And then the other moment where it starts to explode and become really popular outside of the revolutionary battle sites themselves is during the Civil War. And I'm not exactly sure why this got so popular, but one of the fundraising sources that became popular during the Civil War was voluntary sanitary commissions. These are voluntary organizations of non-military affiliated people would raise money for Union Army hospitals in particular. And early in the war, they were doing lots of different things, basically like bake sales and art exhibitions and like selling flowers and all different kinds of things. But later in the war, and I'm not exactly sure why this turning point happens, but in around 1863, 1864, these explode in popularity, which are commission fairs. And at these commission fairs, this started fairly small and then started to explode and include more and more different exhibits. These exhibits would include like the Troy booth and the Syracuse booth and the Dutch booth and the Irish booth and the Indian booth and the Oriental booth and the Gypsy booth. So like these national booths that people would walk around. I'm not exactly sure what space this was held in Albany itself. It was some interior space where people would go buy a ticket to get in, and then they could go and buy things from each individual booth and meet the people at them. So at the Albany version of this, but this was true of other ones as well, there were all of these different nationality booths with more or less historical flavor. So the Dutch booth largely was like a recreation of a 17th century Dutch home in Albany. Makes sense, you know, with where we are. The Troy, Syracuse, Schenectady booths were like just modern people hanging out. But then there was also a Yankee booth of New Englanders, but that were actually from just people from Albany, who recreated a revolutionary Yankee New England home with a genuine 200-year-old butter churn from Connecticut. I don't know why you paid to go see that, but whatever. And like these domestic interiors were seen as this like historical moment of like what it is really to be American, and to be a Union supporter in particular, of experiencing not only the breadth of Union support in our local area, Troy, Schenectady, Syracuse, etc., but also the historical aspect of that. And one of the historical aspects of that was the Indian wigwam here, which was supposedly decorated with canoes and snowshoes and kind of tchotchkes, and staffed entirely by white Albany residents. Most of the women and men who staffed these were fairly elite Dutch families mostly, who were doing this as part of like their volunteering. And they would do things like sell curios. The Indian wigwam had like beaded things, as well as like raffle items. So these people are representing Hiawatha, Nokomis, Pocahontas, I forget the fourth one, and then Caroline Parker, which is a name that sounds kind of not like the other ones. Hiawatha, Nokomis, and Pocahontas, and then the other one are figures from kind of the mythic past. Like Pocahontas obviously was a real person, Hiawatha probably was, but they're people who had been mythologized in literature of the period by that point. Caroline Parker, who's this one over on the far right, with this kind of beaded flower design in the far bottom of her skirt, was actually alive at the time. She was like 40 years old, maybe only 35. And she's particularly interesting as being included in this because she was well known enough to be included in this because she was an adamant advocate against assimilation. So she, the outfit that the woman representing her is wearing, Caroline Parker had made while she was a student at the normal school that preceded UAlbany. Caroline Parker attended there. If you've been hearing the news about Indian Pond and Indian Pond Drive are getting renamed to Parker Pond and Parker Pond Drive, she's the woman why, because she attended here. And Caroline had made, while she was a student here, this ensemble for the New York State Museum representing the ancient and traditional customs of the Iroquois. And that's that dress. And she had made it as part of this argument to the state legislature that the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee are distinct, separate national entities that could not be assimilated with the United States, as the federal government in New York State was pressuring at the time. So her inclusion here as part of a mythic Native past and essentially part of the American story is really flipping on its head in everything that she had been arguing for. And I think it's part of this tongue-in-cheek racism of trying to control this narrative of what Native people were doing in this period by literally donning her clothes as part of this reenactment. So I'm going to skip the rest of the 19th and 20th century because I haven't done that research yet. So we're just going to zoom on by. So I'm going to talk about for the rest of that. That's kind of the 1788 to 1864, the prior part. There's a lot of stuff that happens, especially in the early 20th century, where people are kind of grappling with immigration and demographic change as part of this story. And I'm going to kind of zoom forward to like the 1980s, 1990s, and today, like a pop station. So the narratives have changed quite a lot. I would say that the early part of this story was how reenactment and public history have been used to define both who is part of the American nation, but almost more who is not. The Albany Sanitary Commission Fair, for example, had no portrayals of Black presence whatsoever. Even though there was about 20% of the population of Albany at the time was Black. There were Black servers and janitors at the restaurants at the commission fairs, but they were not represented as part of the historical figures. That's changed really radically in the last like 50 years or so, or especially in the last 10 to 20. There's been a lot more push both from hobby reenactors and formal museums as well to include Native history, women's history, Asian history, and Black history in the stories of the Revolution. But the public still doesn't quite know how to grapple with that. So one example of this is a photograph from the Battle of Newtown near Elmira, New York. And this is an example of one place where the formalized story or the official institutional story has changed quite a lot, but the public response is still kind of grappling with what that change means. So the Battle of Newtown, 1779, is one of the largest campaigns of the United States against the Iroquois, and the largest campaign of the United States at all to that point in the war. Most expensive, most men committed, and it really decisively changed the course of the war by pushing the Iroquois out of what's now New York State, really definitively in a lot of ways. Created a huge refugee population and really turned the tide of the war. For much of the 19th and 20th century, this was celebrated as a grand American victory in like extremely racist terms. Like there's still a monument standing at the state historic site that was erected in 1929, one of the anniversaries, that celebrates the defeat of the savages. And it's like the Seneca are still living there very much, like very nearby to this historic site. So like that language is still all over the landscape in roadside markers and signs, everything, this state historic site. But beginning in about the early 2000s, the state Historic Preservation Parks Department started working with Seneca Nation to update how this history was presented. So there's new signage alongside the old signage at the historic site. And they've also revamped what the reenactment looks like. There had been a reenactment at the state historic site, the battlefield, from like the 1970s on, that very much followed that older narrative of the triumphant American rejection of savages from this landscape. But beginning in the 2000s, this collaboration between Seneca Nation and the state historic parks system kind of flipped that narrative. And the narrative now, if you go to the reenactment, and I did this with my 5-year-old this summer, which was not a pleasant experience. We can talk about that and maybe in the Q&A, the experience of having kids with this. But the experience now is that if you as a member of a public go to this reenactment, you take on the role of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois refugees. So what they do is they kind of group you into these groups of like 50 to 100. You got your cranky 5-year-old that you're dragging along. It's kind of buggy and hot. And I did not actually realize that that was what they were doing, because the reenactors who are tasked with interpreting this are mostly volunteers. And like, obviously, between people, the script sometimes changes, but they never once said, you, the public, are Iroquois refugees. They just told us that we were refugees. And that's particularly, I think, interesting. I mean, one, you have like the broader problem of whether or not the state historic system is inviting non-native people to play Indian, which is its own problem. But then there's also the problem of so what they did with us was they kind of walked us through this trail in the woods, and we were escorted by British reenactors or British soldiers, and the members of the public were being shot on, like fired upon from these rails. It was a very interesting experience because like you couldn't see what was happening. You could hear yelling in the woods, you could hear shots fired and things, but you couldn't quite see what was going on. And the British reenactors kept telling us, we'll take care of you, we'll keep you safe, ma'am, like just keep going, we'll protect you from the rebels. And the public thought that we were American refugees. Like listening to the crowd around us, they kept asking the British soldiers when they would attack us. They kept asking the people, the native people who were portraying native people when they would attack us. And like there were a bunch of native men also escorting us. The American public was convinced that they were portraying American civilians, even though there were no American civilians living there at the time to be escorted. And I think this is in part just a difficulty in the messaging. Like it was loud, it's hard to get that across in a bit, but like several of the native reenactors did tell us, you are the Haudenosaunee women and children after a while. But the public that I was with, at least the group of about 50 or 100, was absolutely convinced that we were going to be attacked by the Indians and the British. So it's just this part of this ingrained narrative that people have of like, they are American now, so therefore, like their sympathies must be with the Americans in the past. And like complicating that script on a public history level, I think is particularly difficult. Like, how do you message around that? So as we approach the 250th of the American Revolution, like at the 200th bicentennial in 1976, attendance at these things absolutely exploded. A lot of historic sites are grappling with like, how much do we change the narrative? How much can we change the narrative? Should we? What kind of pushback are we going to receive? Because occasionally there is some kinds of pushback. I'm not going to have time a lot to talk about that today, but we can touch on that in the Q&A if you're interested. The rest of my talk, I'm going to talk more about kind of individual and political ramifications. Why do people do this? So I'm going to start with kind of individual level. Why do individual people do this? And then zoom out to kind of bigger levels of why people participate in these kinds of events as reenactors themselves. Because it's kind of silly, which I say with affection. Academic history is also kind of silly. Both academic historians and reenactors spend a whole lot of time and money on things that a lot of other people don't always care about. Sometimes they're different things, sometimes they're the same things, like investigating. One of the things that academic historians and reenactors have in common is there's this raging debate over what's appropriate for a working class woman to carry. Would it be a hard-sided basket, a soft-sided purse, a soft-sided basket, nothing at all because she has pockets? Because this has ramifications as far as like, are women seen as working in public spaces, which is like a legitimate academic question and like perceptions, but like, man, what do you carry in your hand? I don't know, a cranky 5-year-old. So it's kind of on the micro level, it can be sort of silly, but it takes on really deep implications. One of the personal levels that reenacting takes on really deep meaning is in the performance of gender. So increasingly in recent years, there was a landmark court case against the national park system in the 1990s with Civil War reenacting, that people who are assumed female at birth may portray men at military reenactments, and that at least the federal government can't prohibit this. This hasn't been tested at the state or hobby level, but that's on the federal level been established. So increasingly since the 1990s, a lot of hobby groups have seen cis women like Judith here, or trans men portraying men. And for the most part, trans men have been welcomed without any hesitation by most hobby groups. Like there's been no question and no pushback from, so far as I've heard from any of the trans men that I have interviewed. Where there has been pushback has been against cis women's portrayals. That is, women who act in women's roles in their civilian life, their modern life, but occasionally portray women, or excuse me, occasionally portray men in a military context. And part of this tension is over when is this gender crossing seen as necessary? Some trans men that I spoke to reported getting pushback initially when they first transitioned, and that they occasionally faced some pushback, but once they had transitioned fully, they no longer face pushback, and they portray both military men and civilian men in the 18th century. Cis women's portrayals are a little bit more complicated. There's a long history since the 1970s of a lot of hobby units are very concerned about how many men they can field. Like to meet contracts, to make it look like there's a full unit, a full regiment, like a historically sized regiment. So there was actually a retrospective of one of these units published very recently that kind of in a celebratory way said that in 1976, they had to pressure wives, girlfriends, and daughters to take on men's uniforms in order to meet contracts for 1976 bicentennial parades because they needed the bodies. And like our wives, girlfriends, and daughters were there. We had extra uniforms. We needed the contract, so we got it. But thankfully, the retrospective said that ended when we recruited more men. So cis women's portrayals of men's were seen as essential for numbers, but not essential for themselves. So there's been a lot more pushback against whether it's allowable or not for women who see themselves as women to portray men. Many of the women that I interviewed for this said that they felt uncomfortable portraying civilian men because they had been told that that wasn't necessary. Military men's portrayals might be tolerated because they're seen as still necessary for meeting numbers, but not civilian men's. And there's actually the largest kind of umbrella insurance organization for hobby units right now is going to be holding a vote to change its bylaws in the spring because they still have in their bylaws that women who are women in their daily lives may not portray men. And that's still on the books from 1976. And privately, the president of the organization told me that he didn't think it was going to pass, but that he feels it needs to because they may face a legal challenge based on that 1990 federal case. So it's still very much something that there's a lot of tension over. Individually, a lot of the trans men I've spoken to have said that like portraying men when they were not sure whether they wanted to transition was an important part of confirming that they wanted to transition in all parts of their lives. Because one man told me that when he had started portraying a man, his unit wanted him to portray a woman who portrayed a man like Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson is a famous example of a 18th century woman who served as a man during the Revolution, and later after the Revolution went back to her civilian life as a woman. And this man told me that that was kind of the moment where he knew that he was not a woman because he was so deeply uncomfortable with that idea of, yes, it's okay for him to portray a man, but then he would have to interpret to the public and explain that really he was a woman. So that was a really important part of his kind of self-realization was that reenacting component. On kind of a larger public historical education level, other people engage in the hobby for a vast array of other reasons. Some people are interested in the period itself. A lot of people are interested in the community. But there's been an uptick since 2016 and even 2020 in the numbers of Black and Asian men who have been joining hobby units. And this is Joe Becton, who's a member of the 1st Rhode Island, which is one of the historically all Black units of the Revolution. And Joe has been reenacting since the 1970s. There's a large handful of Black men who have been reenacting since the 1970s. And one of the continuities among Black men in particular that I've spoken to is that they feel that they need to visually present the presence of non-enslaved people, non-enslaved Black people's presence in the Revolution to counter narratives that Black people are not really part of the nation. Joe told me a story that he was at a reenactment with the rest of the 1st Rhode Island, which is all Black men as it historically was. And he was asked by a member of, and not asked, a question was yelled from the crowd, "Aren't you guys all slaves?" And he said that that was the reason that he reenacted, because he felt that there was such a public perception, both among the broader white public, but also among like the Black school groups that he visited, that Black people were only slaves. And like, of course, Black enslaved people did escape and serve both among the Loyalists and the Continentals. But he felt deeply that he needed to portray that citizenship and military service had been always part of that story, because the opposite is so deeply ingrained. And he said that he's seen among the First Rhode Island and other groups, because of an uptick of what he feels is racial resentment of non-white people as part of the American nation since 2016. His unit has seen a lot more younger Black men in their 20s joining, and other units have had additional Asian men. This is particularly a post-2016 trend, joining, making similar arguments that they want to show the broader public that their ancestors have always been part of this story. And then I'm going to end on kind of a broader note of like, why does this matter for many populations? I touched on the inclusion or exclusion of Native people in different places and times, excuse me. And in large part, I would say that this is following the trend of people like Joe Becton and the Battle of Newtown, where there's greater visibility, greater inclusion of Native people's stories as told by Native populations. That Battle of Newtown was done in collaboration with Seneca Nation. But there's also concern, therefore, about who is telling these stories or participating in them. It used to be very prevalent that non-Native people would portray Native people at these reenactments. That's this whole other thing that I'm going to spend a chapter on in the book. But there's also concern among many nations over how reenactments are used in legal cases. So this is in 2022. Haverford College staged a reenactment of, and this is the modern component and not the historical component because I couldn't find a good photo of it, but Haverford College in Pennsylvania staged a reenactment of Penn's signing of the treaty with Lenape Nation. And there was reiterations of these in the 18th century as well, with a group that's called the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. The Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania is a 501c3. It is not actually a state or federally recognized government. The nation that the federal government recognizes as descendants of Lenape Nation in Pennsylvania is the Lenape Nation of Oklahoma. And currently, like right now, Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania have filed a petition for federal recognition using Haverford College's historical reenactment as part of their argument that they have historically been recognized as an existing Native government. That's one of the legal criteria of federal recognition. I've been a witness on federal recognition cases for other nations. I'm not involved in this case. I personally, from my past experience, I think it's unlikely that this is going to succeed, but Lenape Nation of Oklahoma is extremely concerned about it succeeding, because they think it opens the door for other reenactors to become involved in federal recognition cases. And if it's successful, it makes this claim for access to like land that's held in trust and other resources that like Lenape Nation of Oklahoma has only recently won back themselves. So like these can be very intensely personal, and they can have a lot of ramifications for like the stories we tell, the stories we understand of who's part of the nation, but they also can have very specific ramifications financially for how much resources like Lenape Nation of Oklahoma has to do things like provide access to healthcare, provide education, provide just ability for people to return to historic homelands. So they can have very specific consequences in the modern era. So I'm going to just end there for Q&A. My editor told me to do this. I apologize. This is my first book. If you order, I'll move the thing here. If you order through the Cornell Press site, They gave me a discount code for 30% because it's too expensive. There's too many pictures in it. My first book is on how women before 1864, including Caroline Parker that attended here at UAlbany, used clothing to create these stories about nations. That's kind of what got me interested in this second project. And it's focused in what has become New York State, thinking about clothing as a tool of creating nation. So that's the discount code if you're interested in that. And that's my email as well.
Wow.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I found this very interesting and I didn't know what to expect of your thought. But it reminds me that the victors get to write the histories and that becomes what kids learn in school. And I was reminded of this morning when I read in the local paper a story about the Smiley brothers who started the Mohonk Mountain House. I used to love to go to the Mohonk Mountain House before it became too expensive to go there. But the story always was that these nice Quaker brothers wanted to have a nice Protestant option to the Jewish resorts in the Catskills. So they created the Mohonk Mountain House. Well, of course, the land that they're on belonged to the Native Americans. So they appropriated it, and then they compounded it by one of the brothers being on a national commission, and it led to things like the appropriation of other native lands, and also sending kids to those training schools and trying to beat the Indian out of the children, which led to, of course, generational problems that still exist. It just makes me so pissed off. I will never go back to the Mohawk. But it's a reminder that they can tell the story any way they want to. I mean, this is not in any of their literature. And in fact, they make the original brothers out as heroes, when in fact they're villains. And that's what makes me mad, because I was a history major and I see it perpetuated all the time. And but thank you very much.
Thank you
for your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, this is to be honest, things like that, thinking about the 2026 250th anniversary, and especially, to be really frank, the Trump election and the 2020 election was part of what got me thinking about this, because during the Trump administration, a lot of national parks sites and historic sites in states with Republican legislatures were threatened with, I mean, like many institutions, libraries, public radio, schools, universities, were threatened with having their funding revoked if they didn't toe the line on, certain narratives. That's the Trump administration had the 1776 commission that was like, that was the mission, was there's going to be a particular American story. And like, I think that weaponization of early American history is it's fairly unique in the last 20 years. Like, there's been threads of it earlier in the 20th century, but like, it's been so particularly weaponized by the right. Early on, when I was working on this project, I was at a preschooler's birthday party, because that's the stage of life I'm in. But I was telling somebody that I had just gotten back from one of these things. And I was like, oh, I'm so tired. These things are so hard. Like, I just spent, all weekend running around in the woods following these things. It was a similar situation with Newtown. And the parent that I was talking to was like, oh yeah, I bet that would be exhausting, because all those people are just like Trump voting, whatever. Like, I bet they were just horrible. And I was like, oh, it's really interesting, because like, I had just had a couple of conversations with reenactors. Like, the thing with reenactors is you get all types. So there are absolutely people who are in it because like traditional American values, and are interested in that weaponization of early American history. But there's also a large number of people who like Joe Becton, like others, join to interpret to the public what they see as a broader narrative, as well as like people who joined during the Vietnam era who portrayed military men specifically because they were anti-war. And they wanted to portray military units because they wanted to show people how horrible war had been. And that was very deeply part of their interpretation and their participation in the hobby. So these control of narratives, I think in the popular memory, the right has been very successful in controlling a lot of these narratives, even though in other spaces there has been other stories told. So that's a large part of my fascination there. I think you had, and then you.
I know you said that you have yet to really delve into this research, but I'm interested in the kind of role that Revolutionary War reenactment might have played within lost cause ideology. And it seems what you just said was in this era.
Yeah.
It has been weaponized in that way. Was it weaponized also in the rise of the lost cause?
I don't know. Part of what I have been struggling with this project on just on a research level, I don't see a lot of this happening in the South. Like there's Colonial Williamsburg is the famous one in 1934. And that Williamsburg, I think, I haven't been down to their archives for this project yet. That's the one where I suspect there's a connection to the lost cause, because Williamsburg's beginnings are all about like the genteel and gentle South, where slavery is not visible. There's a couple of descriptions of the tea room at Williamsburg is the first thing that opens, and it's this very intentionally domestic space where like the first reenacting is in the restaurant, and all the cooks and janitors are black and in the kitchen and nobody sees them, but all the servers are white women. So that's the place where I suspect that I'll see more of that. But like there's just not a lot of Veters, there's no sanitary commission fairs, anything like that. And then in the 20th century, there's stuff like New York City has this Hudson Fulton parade that then gets reenacted in a couple of different places. And I don't see similar things happening in the South, so I'm not quite sure what to do with that yet. So that's a great question. Yes, sir.
So many years ago, I was living with a friend in southern Maine. He was a reenactor. Actually, he would dress up in deer skins. He thought he was an Indian.
Yeah.
And either that or a half-breed trapper or something. And I hang out with these guys, and I had to get a black powder rifle, and they just love to shoot.
Yeah.
I mean, they could use the live ammunition because we were out in the woods. And cannons, they would put, Campbell soup cans full of concrete and shoot the cannon.
Yeah.
And how much of the gun culture is really invested in these reenactors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's similar to the political thing. Like there's different threads and genealogies. One of the things that I find interesting about this is like, excuse me, there is umbrella organizations. It's what's called the Big Three. Right now, they originated during the bicentennial era, and they're kind of like how units get their insurance, like instead of just buying it through your homeowner's insurance or whatever, so that like if you shoot somebody accidentally, you're covered by insurance. Has happened, rarely, but has happened. There was an incident earlier this summer where somebody shot a live ammunition to the roof of a historic house. So that's why you have insurance. So the gun culture, in recent years, less. There's been a large push, and this has been very divisive, for more civilian interpretation. So like both civilian men who are portraying farmers, merchants, things like that in the context of this, because historically there was a large number of civilians present in army camps, as well as women and enslaved non-combatants and things like that. But like the official genealogy, what I would call like the official pedigree of it, is coming out of, so first those Civil War veterans who are reenacting like during the war itself. Those became kind of social clubs in the late 19th, early 20th century, and gun collector clubs. So in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there was like a huge uptick in Civil War gun collecting, where they would do things like fire live ammunition of Civil War guns and like demonstrate these. Those turned into what we would now think of as modern Civil War reenactment units. And out of those grew, and with a strong focus on shooting originals and shooting like reproduction guns. And that's where the big three organizations grew out of. There was this splinter in the 1963 or 4 where members of these Civil War gun clubs split and said that they wanted to form more accurate demonstrations of American Revolutionary shooting demonstrations for the upcoming bicentennial, but it was very much coming out of gun clubs. Some of them shooting original American Revolution pieces, which I'm like, how do you, like, those things explode when it gets bad. So yeah, yes.
So you know what, nobody in the room probably knows this, there is a business called the Dixie Gun Works, where you can purchase parts
Yeah.
for many of these, including barrels, you know, whatever part of the mechanisms you need. Up to small cannons, I don't know if that's still allowed. But there's a lot out there, both Revolutionary and Civil War. Have a lot of people that follow it, and they like to get as real as possible. I saw when my dad used to rebuild them for people, so I know just a tiny bit about it. And the test is you overload piece,
Okay.
and fire it from behind a rampart, just in case.
Okay.
But yeah, the stuff's out there. You can easily order it online,
Yeah.
and have it delivered. But you know, it's in there. There's a lot of people that do reenactments.
Yeah.
And they like to have stuff has to be accurate. Your uniform, your weapons, even your meal kit. They want accuracy so that you're part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a part of the conversation. So I think I forgot to mention this. I've interviewed about 80 people. I'm still conducting interviews for this. But like one of the things that I talk to folks in interviews of, like, who's their favorite suppliers? How do they know that stuff's accurate? Like, how do they do their research? Like, where do they buy their guns? Because like one of the difficulties is like, how do you onboard new people? In the 1970s, like a lot of the units that I've talked to are kind of grappling with like the aging and the graying of the hobby, because what they have said is that in the 1970s, the accuracy standards were relatively lower. Somebody could show up with like their jeans and a white cotton shirt and like, borrow a gun or whatever that was made in Pakistan or China or something that was, relatively cheap. If you do the real deal now, it's like $6,000 for a gun and like as much, or like in the several thousands for a fully done uniform and everything. So it's a big barrier for like young families, young people with student debt, things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of conversations about the manufacturers.
And you talked about how in many of these reenactments, or at least in some of them, women were playing men. Was there much of a role for a woman playing a woman in any of these reenactments?
Yeah.
Or was that common, or are they typically only male soldiers in these reenactments? So
that's one of was that a hand, Scott? Or no? So one of the things that's changed from the 1976 bicentennial era to now is there has always been women portraying women, but whether or not it was seen as essential has changed a lot. So in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, one of the arguments that many units made was that women weren't really part of this story. There was not a sense of like camp followers being involved. And this was true in the academic scholarship as well, that like women were not part of these stories. They were not even present. But the hobby units made this argument that if you can get a guy's wife or girlfriend to come out on the weekend with him, he'll stay in the unit for longer. So that they had, and like this is explicit in a lot of the early recruiting materials. So like they made an effort, 70s, 80s, 90s of like, women's teas and children's activities and like children's craft activities to like give a reason for the whole family to come out as an explicit recruiting strategy. That has shifted to place more emphasis on like there's increasing scholarship that shows that like yes, women were physically there, and there's been tension within the reenacting community about characterizing that, not only with like the handbag or basket thing, but also what is a camp follower. A lot of women that I have interviewed reported to me that they stopped reenacting because so many people, both men and women, put an emphasis on camp follower means prostitute, and that they felt pressured to portray that they were prostitutes themselves in their public education, or like felt pressured that they had to interact like that in their 18th century reenactment. There's been pushback against that recently, so it's less common, but like I've spoken to a lot of women that like joined, portrayed for a while, and then left, and then are only recently returning because it's been kind of a change. So like there's a lot of like intersections between what people think is historically accurate, whether that's in like guns, uniforms, and mess kits, and using historical accuracy as a means of modern sexual harassment, or you know, racial harassment, things like that. I think Scott and then
My sister's a camp follower,
okay, cool.
was one.
Cool.
Her first husband was a 18th century reenactor.
Oh, cool.
He wore a bearskin hat, and during the bicentennial, got really tired of being in a very small group of Brits when there's thousands of.
Yeah.
But she became a camp follower, and she got very annoyed at people
Yeah.
who said, "Yeah, camp follower." And she goes, "No, I had to dress in meticulously period clothes and that sort of thing." And she described this one gentleman who showed up at one of these reenactments with a gun kit that he had put together that was about 40 years dissimilar from the actual battle. And he became a pariah. Nobody talked to him for the entire rest of the reenactment. It's a real, very interesting sort of situation.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to recommend that Saratoga National Battlefield has done a wonderful exhibit that's fairly new, portraying the women, and no, they don't regard them as prostitutes, on both the British side and the American side. Since the Germans brought their wives with them, and there's a whole woman who does reenactment of Baroness von Riesdale, and I've seen her, she's very good. I just wanted to advertise that for the world, since the park didn't get closed yet.
Yes. Yeah. Some of the UAlbany Masters in Public History students have worked with that exhibit. So like our department is very involved with them. Yeah.
That's right. And cook the food. Do you cook the food? Yeah.
Yeah, you had to use the right kettle too.
Oh,
And like, they had a woman carrying something, but I can't remember. What it was. I think it was a purse, a leather pouch type thing.
Yeah.
There you go.
Was it soft or?
Like a leather, almost like a Native American thing.
Yeah. So like the purse thing or the basket thing has a lot to do with like perceptions of social class. Like, would a wealthy woman be carrying her own basket full of like her grocery shopping? Probably not. She probably would have like a fancy little purse with like her sewing or whatever. But then like, how do you apply that up and down the social scale for women you don't have documentation for? So. It's me. Yeah.
Have there been any portrayals or reenactments of, for example, I'm pulling this one out of my hat. For example, Dutchess County was, you had two armies crossing.
Yeah.
And basically at some point it was pointed out that the populace just didn't give a rat's backside anymore because they were being handed scrip from both armies.
Yeah.
Which was useless. So their apple crops were being grabbed, their cattle were being stolen by both sides.
Yeah, so
And
that's
I guess I call it a depolitization of the area. They were just absolutely fed up. with
Yeah.
everything.
so that's been one of the changes in recent years, and the reason that there's been an uptick in civilian portrayals is precisely to portray that. So in the lower Hudson in particular, there's been like one of the difficulties with reenacting is like there's nobody being like, we need X number of British and X number of Americans. You're American this weekend. You're British this weekend. It's all people who are like, I'm British. That's who I am. And then you show up, and it's whoever like shows up that weekend. So sometimes you get this really big disjuncture between what the site wants as far as portrayals and who actually has the kit and can portray that and is willing and interested. So there's been a big effort to recruit people to do those civilian portrayals. So at the Battle of Yorktown this year, they really wanted to get civilian portrayals to like, they had this whole plan. I talked to the organizer. They had this plan to have a bunch of farmers with like a couple of wheelbarrows of cabbages. They rented some historic looking oxen to be there, and they wanted all these farmers to be there with like, to just basically like boo both sides and be like, we're not selling it to you anything. But then it rained and only one guy showed up. So it's like, yes, there is interest, but like, because it's a hobby, there's such a, and like, there's been other events like the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. It's passed for this year, but every September they do a Occupying Philadelphia event where there's this little National Register street that's like all 18th century houses near the museum, and they staff it entirely with civilians and the correct ratios of like soldiers, occupying British soldiers. And the public experience is for you to go and experience what it is to be in a city that's occupied by a hostile force, and that they successfully are able to staff. So the Yorktown one is, I just found funny. Yes, ma'am.
So, United Empire Loyalists, are they ever included?
They are. There's a lot of there's a lot of back and forth about portrayals of loyalists. So it's kind of an upswing right now. It was out, like these things kind of go in and out of fashion. What kind of portrayals are in fashion? Loyalists are in some ways, there's kind of two big political divides among reenactors. One is the modern Democratic Republican political divide that sometimes maps onto what people portray historically, and then a related political divide between kind of more old school, what reenactors would call kind of old school portrayals, and what's called progressive portrayals, where like highly accurate or say they're highly accurate, and like most in touch with the formal public history side of the field, formal academic history side of the field. Like there's a lot of resentment in some ways from other reenactors of progressives, because progressives are seen as like condescending or like hoity-toity and like talking down to other reenactors. And those don't, the Democrat, Republican, and progressive old school divides don't map neatly onto each other, but they're related because many people who portray loyalists or portray British are stereotyped by other reenactors as being both progressives and Democrats, because they make the argument that the American Continentals were not that great and American Empire was not that great and America is actually very bad. So like there's this perception that British regulars and civilian loyalists are all Democrats and progressives, because some people have made that argument, but it becomes this really weird mapping of historical and modern politics that I like. This is why I'm like got dug so far into this book. It's like, who would think that the British Empire is the Democrats? Like I heard that one the first time somebody told me, I was like, you need to explain to me the reasoning behind that one.
My brother-in-law was an Eisenhower.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, I thought I heard you say that the reenactments are also taking place of the Vietnam War. When I think you said that some people were trying to represent that some soldiers were pacifists.
So that is happening. What I had said was that during the Vietnam era, American Revolutionary reenactments sometimes made pacifist arguments. However, there is right now reenactments of the Vietnam War, of the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the two Gulf Wars. Many of them are veterans or sons of veterans of those conflicts. I think for many of the same reasons as Nicholas Veeder, not the financial aspect, but the like representing the couple that I've talked to have said that they do it because they're conscious, because they feel like the memory of Vietnam was like Vietnam service was besmirched, and they want to make sure that their service or their father's service is not remembered by the public as, you know, so many of these men are themselves veterans of those conflicts. So which, like, as with Veeder, blurs the line between, is this reenacting or is this representation? This is something else. But I think that that's a long thread of continuity, because like that's exactly what Veeder was doing, and General Schuyler. So
Thanks.
Well, thank you very
yeah,
much.
thank you. Thank you all. Your questions were amazing.